Hello everyone, this is Jade, and when I was 10 years old, I was the biggest little Star Trek Enterprise fan, potentially in existence, among my age group, anyway. Now, almost 2 decades later, I'm revisiting the series with adult, critical eyes, trying to see what I liked about it when I was a kid, and enjoy it for what it is now that I have a better understanding of media and my own preferences, and just for fun. It's a comfort show for me. I know I've always known the theme song by heart, and I'm excited to see the characters every week. But speaking of comfort, this week I have to give a warning. This channel's first trigger warning, actually. In this week's set of episodes, which starts with Fusion and ends with Shockwave Part 1, we will be discussing sexual assault extensively. It's a very big part of the first episode that we're going to be discussing, and it's unavoidable to discuss it. If you're one of those people who watches these videos without having seen the show that it's based on, it's important that you are aware of that before we get into a very long discussion of an extremely in-depth examination of the factors and effects of sexual assault, which occur in the very first episode today. So this week we are finishing season 1. I thought there were actually 25 episodes because of the off by 1 error that I've referenced previously. There are technically 25 episodes if you count the first 2-parter as only 1, but episode numbers 17 through 26 are all technically part of season 1. For that reason, we're accidentally doing 10 episodes this week. My goal for the rest of this series is to cover 1/3 of a season per week. However, that stacks up. The seasons do vary slightly in length. So this week we're going to be talking about 10 episodes, and at the end I'm going to go over a really interesting spreadsheet I've been creating. I've mentioned previously that I roped several of my friends and family members into rewatching this with me, especially including my classmates from the data science graduate program that I'm currently enrolled in. We're watching this together, taking extensive notes, and we've started to put together a little bit of a spreadsheet on some of our thoughts about each episode. This past weekend, we ranked the episodes ourselves and then compared our rankings as a group to the rankings that show up when you look at IMDb. IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, is an extremely valuable resource for looking at people's opinions of television episodes, particularly Enterprise, in the scope of Star Trek, because IMDb already existed when it was airing. We can see people's reactions from the week this came on, still preserved in IMDb. There are about 2,000 ratings per episode, which is a decent sample size, and it's very interesting to me to see which factors contribute to what makes an episode popular or what makes an episode considered good. I mentioned last week that I was having a really tough time figuring out what the correlation was between high and low IMDb user ratings. However, I think I've started to crack the code. So at the end of the 10 episode overview, I'm going to go over what me and my classmates have found looking at the data from the episodes that we covered this week and for the past 2 weeks in season 1. And I'll be doing this each time I do an episode that covers the end of a season. So I'd like to get started with Fusion. Right out of the gate, I'm going to tell you that this is probably the episode I'm going to talk the most about. And that's because I firmly believe that the most thought was put into this episode. This isn't my favorite episode this season, but I do think it's the one that the most effort was put into, and rightfully so. This is an extremely delicate topic, and it was approached as well as anything I've ever seen has approached this topic, particularly for 2001, and I'd like to explain why. In 2023's media landscape, the topics of sexual assault, stalking, abuse, and other emotionally difficult topics comes up way more often than it did in 2001. However, due to the way society has changed since then, I personally feel that these topics are typically approached now with a degree of therapy speak that can make them almost useless to people who are not already familiar with the topic. The way certain series approach topics like sexual assault and abuse seems to be more focused on communicating to the audience that it is unacceptable to do these things than to communicate to the audience exactly what happens when something like this happens. This isn't to specifically complain about any other series, Star Trek or otherwise, but to highlight the value of an episode like Fusion, particularly in 2001. It was uncommon in 2001 to dedicate an episode to examining, in extreme granularity, the factors from all sorts of angles that contribute to the sexual assault of someone you know, even perpetrated by someone you think that you trust. And this episode is not widely beloved in the Star Trek compendium because it makes people uncomfortable. But I think it's important that something like this exists. Last week we talked about Fortunate Son and Dear Doctor, two episodes that seriously fumbled the Star Trek formula of presenting a moral quandary in a science fiction way. But Fusion and a couple of the other episodes we're going to examine today show the real strength that Enterprise has instead of that. And that's showing emotionally complicated situations and people's realistic reactions to them. I don't believe that TNG could have pulled this off, just as Enterprise cannot pull off an episode that asks a serious science fiction question. But this episode respectfully, delicately puts a science fiction filter over something that affects many people. This is something that Enterprise can do that other Star Treks can't, and I think that's incredibly valuable. So what happens in this episode is that the Enterprise encounters a ship full of Vulcans who have split off from contemporary Vulcan society. These Vulcans have decided to embrace emotion along with logic and have developed a new way of life. Immediately, Archer is fascinated by these people. He sees a group of Vulcans who are, in his eyes, better than any of the Vulcans he's encountered, particularly T'Pol, the one he lives with. Immediately, he begins to see this as an opportunity to change T'Pol into someone he would get along with better, someone he would prefer to have on the bridge. We really get familiar with three of the Vulcans. The first one is the captain. The first thing he does when he gets onto the ship is ask to try their chicken, which makes an impression on Archer. He begins to think, why doesn't T'Pol do this? We meet Kov, an engineer who has separated from his family. There's a very well-executed subplot with Trip. Kov befriends Trip very quickly, and the two start asking each other about human and Vulcan physiology and culture, and they make a very sweet friendship. But Archer is contacted by the Vulcan High Command through Starfleet and asked to get Kov to call his father. Kov has fallen out of contact with his family since he embraced emotion, and now his father is dying. Over the course of the episode, Trip is tasked with talking Kov into calling his dad. I really, really appreciate Trip's role on the ship. As we previously stated, the heart. It's important that there is someone approachable who is emotionally intelligent and able to relate to people as an equal. Of course, it's important to have somebody like Phlox around who is available as sort of a wise resource people can go to, but he'll never be anybody's friend in an equal capacity. Trip is really important to the balance of the cast because he can have conversations with people without feeling intimidating. He tells a story to Kov about how when he was in elementary school, he was very excited to ask a girl that he went to school with to dance, and he never did, and he still thinks about it as this source of shame. It's a crude metaphor for not wanting to have regrets about not speaking to your parent before they die, but that sort of innocent, unthreatening way of trying to relate to people is the strength that Trip brings to the crew. I really appreciated this plotline. I really liked Kov. And eventually he does decide to call his father. I'm sure some viewers may be uncomfortable with the idea of being told to contact your estranged family member who disowned you, but I do think the episode takes care to show that Kov came to this decision of his own volition, despite Trip pushing him to do it. He seems satisfied with his choice, and he had his own reasons for doing so. But the last Vulcan we spend significant time with is Talaris. Talaris is a young, attractive, potentially the first officer of the ship, man who joins T'Pol and Archer for dinner when the Vulcans first meet up with them. And he immediately takes what IMDb describes as an uncomfortable interest in T'Pol. I'd like to take a moment to talk about Jolene Blalock's acting. In several places online, I've seen Jolene Blalock, the actress who plays T'Pol, described as the, quote, poor man's Jerry Ryan. Jeri Ryan, in case you don't know, is the actress who played Seven of Nine in Voyager and then again in Picard. Seven of Nine is a character who shares some more than some superficial similarities to T'Pol. They wear similar clothes, are of similar stature, have a similar manner of speaking, and explore many of the same themes. I'd like to remind everyone, by the way, that every Star Trek series features a character who struggles with their emotions, potentially with the exception of Deep Space Nine, which I haven't seen. This type of character is someone who makes it onto the bridge of every Star Trek series. And there are certainly things you can say comparing Seven of Nine and T'Pol, but you can also compare Spock to T'Pol, or Spock to Data, or Data to T'Pol, really. This is a theme that is explored throughout Star Trek, and it's a theme that's explored extensively in Enterprise because of what Enterprise is built on. Enterprise is built on the relationship between humans and Vulcans, and so the emotions of Vulcans, the ethics of the emotions that Vulcans have, all these things are things we're going to be looking at extensively with T'Pol. So I did a little bit of digging. Why do people say that Jolene Blalock is the poor man's Jeri Ryan? And that's, in all of the cases that I could find, it was because this person was upset that T'Pol, in some small way, got in the way of a romantic pairing that they wanted to happen and didn't. I've seen this phrase everywhere, and it turns out it's actually just a couple of people editing pages and commenting on things. They're trolls who are upset that certain romantic relationships didn't work out and decided to blame T'Pol for it. But there's a reason I started looking into this, of course. I've been paying attention to the acting in this show. I think that Scott Bakula is doing a great job working with the, frankly, always changing requirements that he's given as Archer. I've talked about how I think that Connor Trinneer does a fantastic job portraying a whiny and also likable person in Trip. The same goes for Dominic Keating playing Malcolm. They have fantastic chemistry together. They have fantastic chemistry with everybody else. But of everyone in the cast, the amount of thought and effort that they are putting in does not hold a fucking candle to what Jolene Blalock is doing with T'Pol. I'll go ahead and admit that T'Pol is my favorite character. She was my favorite character when I was 10 years old, and she's my favorite character now. And that does make me pay more attention to her when she's on screen. But the little choices that Jolene Blalock is making to communicate what's going on inside T'Pol's mind blow me away. We are able to glean everything about what's going on in this incredibly repressed woman who has no idea what the hell she's thinking about at any given time, who never moves her face. Do you have any idea how impressive that is? There's a moment in the beginning of Fusion where T'Pol has to pass a plate from the captain of the Vulcan ship to Archer, and she holds the plate in front of her face for about a quarter second, and she doesn't move her face at all. She just looks at her reflection in this plate, and you know she is reconsidering every life decision she's ever made that landed her at this dinner table. She's fantastic. Throughout this season and throughout these episodes, we can tell so much information about what T'Pol thinks and feels just from her body language. The way she leans her shoulders towards Trip when they're walking together, but leans her shoulders away from other characters when she's walking with them. The way she shrinks towards or away from people depending on how a conversation is going. The way you can tell by the way she holds herself, whether she's comfortable or trying to leave. It's abundantly clear that hours upon hours of thought were put into how T'Pol expresses and communicates things that she does not want to express or communicate in a way the audience can understand if they pay attention. And if you didn't notice it, I would call attention to this episode, Fusion. Fusion takes all of those decisions and applies them to a larger cast. Despite the fact that the other Vulcans feel emotion, they are not used to expressing things the way humans do. They don't smile or laugh very much. They still have mostly blank facial expressions, and they're not particularly excitable. No amount of self-exploration will turn you into a human child. But we know within the first few minutes of meeting Talaris that he's not someone who can be trusted, but most importantly, we know that he's someone who makes T'Pol deeply uncomfortable. Archer takes T'Pol aside early in the episode and tells her that he would like for her to spend more time with the emotional Vulcans. He says basically that he wishes she was more like them. T'Pol says something that I think encompasses the closest thing this episode has to a moral quandary. It's actually more like a philosophical question. She says, just because they smile and eat chicken doesn't mean they are good people. This episode explores the idea that when you feel more, that leaves you open to being a better or worse person. Vulcans in Enterprise are extremely prone to having the same personality and conforming really, really hard to what the Vulcan High Council wants. But the fact is that that does keep the population in line. T'Pol doesn't consider the idea that someone is trying to harm her because in the culture she comes from, their puritanical way of life prevents people from trying to do harm. What's interesting about this episode is that it goes out of its way to show that T'Pol has been stretching her own limits at her own pace. We know that she's been drinking mint tea and telling jokes, two things that the humans in her life don't notice and don't understand as being a big deal. But to Phlox, for example, he called out that the fact that she was even willing to try carbonated water is a humongous step for Vulcans. To T'Pol, the amount of growth that she's had is astronomical, but because she's only moved the line a little bit relative to what the humans can see, Archer doesn't think she's progressing quickly enough. He sees this example of good Vulcans and thinks, why don't I have that? This episode hit me particularly hard, and not for the reasons many other people may have been hit by this episode. When I was in elementary school, I was what some people may classify as a bully. When I was 7, I did the thing that, is probably pretty common for 7-year-olds. There was a Hindu girl in my class, and I tried to get her to eat a Slim Jim. She wouldn't eat it because it had cow, and I kept insisting to her that I wouldn't tell her parents. I didn't take other people's religion seriously, and of course, this example didn't harm anyone. She did not try the Slim Jim. Nothing happened. But when I was 10, before I started watching Enterprise, there was a girl in my class who was raised atheist. I had never encountered an atheist before, and the only thing I knew about them was that they were going to hell. I actually got in trouble with my teacher a few times for incidents related to this, but he never found out the cause of my mistreatment of this classmate. I would, if she wanted to eat lunch with us, I would make her recite Bible verses. I told her she needed to repent. This person considered me a friend, and I mistreated her extensively, repeatedly, and I did it because I was trying to fix her. There was actually nothing wrong with the way she was behaving. We had actually been classmates for about 3 years before I found out that she wasn't Christian. But when I did, I needed to solve that problem. And the way that I solved it was by treating her like garbage in the hopes that it would make her want to read the Bible. This obviously is not appropriate. Fortunately, this person has managed to remain in my life through a series of crazy coincidences that leave us in each other's orbit at all times. And throughout the years, we've had many falling outs, but ultimately I do believe we're friends, and this particular set of events is long past us. However, for a long time, I felt very bad about what happened when we were in the 5th grade. I was a bully, and I was a bully because I believed that I was better than other people because of the way that I was raised. I had no real justification. We fought all the time for unrelated reasons, but this wasn't why I was doing it. I just wanted to feel like I was better than someone else, and I wanted her to conform to the way my family lived. And I feel like that's a lot like what Archer was doing here. It's not exactly the same, but when I watch Archer in this episode, it frustrates me because I learned this lesson when I was 10, and he's a grown man. So throughout the episode, Talaris tries to get closer to T'Pol. The physical acting is so well executed in this episode. We see her use every possible excuse to try to get out of eating dinner with him and sharing personal information, but he continuously follows her. The thing is, I called Vulcan society puritanical on purpose. T'Pol may be an excellent starship subcommander, but she's incredibly sheltered in other ways. She has never been in this kind of situation before. She's never been pursued by someone who does not respect her boundaries, and she doesn't know when it's dangerous. About halfway through the episode, Archer asks her to go stay on the other Vulcan's ship in the hopes that she will be able to help them with their sensor readings, but also in the hopes that these good Vulcans will rub off on her. This gives Talaris much more access to T'Pol and much more ability to try to get into her head. It takes about 15 seconds for Talaris to recognize what it has taken 6 months for the rest of the crew to not recognize. That T'Pol is actually a very emotional person who is barely disguising what she is feeling and thinking under the surface. He highlights the jokes that she tells and the discomfort that she feels as an excuse to try to tell her that she needs to be more emotional and that his way of life is correct. Eventually, Talaris is able to talk T'Pol into going a night without meditating in the hopes that her dreams will be more emotional, less centered. That night, T'Pol dreams of a time that she snuck out of the Vulcan compound and went to go listen to jazz music. This will come up later. It turns out that this is very distressing for her because she was curious about sneaking out of the compound and curious about human life, but she ended up going home because she was overwhelmed by the guilt and anxiety of sneaking away from where she was supposed to be. She was especially overwhelmed by the fact that she enjoyed the jazz music that she heard when she went into this speakeasy. After that, she dreams of having sex with Talaris, which is understandable because she's been away from every man of her own species for at least 6 months. And this is someone who is taking interest in her. This is the first person who truly acts like they understand her, and she's completely vulnerable. She's been out of contact with her own species, and she's only in contact with people who seem determined to not understand what's going on inside her mind. The moment someone takes a genuine interest in her, she has no emotional way to defend herself. We talked about therapy speak earlier. Deanna Troi from TNG would have had the words to be able to say, "You're not respecting my boundaries, and I need you to stop doing what you're doing." But T'Pol was raised in a society where she is not allowed to think that she has a voice. We talked a little bit about this in Breaking the Ice, where Trip asked her if she actually wanted to marry Koss, and the idea of deciding that for herself was beyond her comprehension. In this episode, there is a point where Talaris asks T'Pol to recall the time that she listened to music, and she is on the verge of tears. She is clearly suffering from the idea that at some point in her life she liked listening to music. We've talked about how T'Pol has difficulty with leadership in her role as first officer, but that also comes from the fact that she has absolutely zero emotional intelligence, and that is by design. Vulcan life prevents Vulcans from learning about their own emotions. It should be abundantly clear by now that Vulcans are not at all without emotion. They are simply trained from birth to pretend that their emotions don't exist. This is a large part of what's wrong with Vulcans and Vulcan culture and Vulcan ideals. But they have made it work because everyone conforms. There is no mind rape on Vulcan because no one even thinks about doing it. So eventually, Talaris is able to talk T'Pol into doing a mind meld with him. I love what the show says about rape in this episode. It gives Talaris every possible out and also says that what he did was wrong. We show that T'Pol was sexually attracted to him. We show that she had a dream that she had sex with him because she hasn't seen another Vulcan in a long time. That doesn't change the fact that what he did was wrong. We show that she originally consented to the mind meld. That doesn't change the fact that what he did was wrong. Anyone doing any amount of observation can see that he manipulated her into that situation because he was so far beyond her emotional understanding of the situation that she was basically a child. So Talaris performs this mind meld, and he takes her back to the point where she snuck out of the Vulcan compound to listen to music. And I also want to call out the science fiction aspect of this episode. There have been other media that deal with mind rape. There have even been books on this channel that we've talked about that dealt with mind rape, but none of them really define what mind rape is. It's usually just like a person clutches their head really hard and they have a really bad headache, and then eventually they get better. In this episode, we examine psychologically what that looks like. Talaris leads T'Pol back to this point in her life where she felt happy about listening to music, but also anxious and guilty about sneaking out of the Vulcan compound. And then he basically holds her there and forces her to wallow in the emotion of anxiety. She tells him she feels uncomfortable. He grabs her and holds her down and tells her to embrace these negative feelings that she's having, because at least she's having them. She tells him she wants to stop, and he refuses. Eventually, T'Pol has to think her way out of the mind meld so that in the physical realm, she can push him physically away from her. After that, she kicks him out of her room, and the characterization of both of these characters is incredible. There's this dichotomy in the design of T'Pol's character. In a command professional situation, she is by the book. She always presents to Archer what the rules say first. She is obsessed with protocol. She does what she thinks she is supposed to do. But on an emotional level, fundamentally, she's a contrarian. Archer has learned how to take advantage of this. If he wants her to do something, he accuses her of the opposite so that she'll do what he wants. But that is also a defense mechanism for her. That is a source of strength for her when she doesn't have much else. When she's kicking Talaris out of her room, he is amused. He tries to push on her that she's angry. He says, "Look at you, you're angry," basically. And you can see she's pissed. But in that moment, she blanks her face, buries her emotions, says, "I am not angry, get out of my room." And she waits until he's out of sight to have an emotional breakdown. I love her to death. After this, though, it becomes clear that something is physically wrong with T'Pol. She crawls over to the intercom in her room and calls sickbay. And Phlox tells Archer that she very possibly suffered neurological damage from what just happened. Archer calls Talaris into his room, and we get to see it's not quite Darvo, deny, accuse, reverse victim and offender, but we get to see the way a rapist tries to get out of this. It's textbook. Archer first asks him, where were you last night? How did you sleep? How are the sensor thingamajigs going? And Talaris pretends everything is fine. Then when Archer asks about what happened between him and T'Pol, he starts taking blame off of himself. He tells Archer that it's something that happened between Vulcans that Archer could never understand, and that T'Pol came to him of her own volition. Eventually, Archer pulls a gun on him and tells him to get out, and that the Vulcans are no longer welcome on his ship. And I'm glad he said the words, "You assaulted a member of my crew." This is one of the times we've seen Archer be most likable. He really steps up here. He really takes accountability. Almost. We'll get back to that in a second. Talaris tries to retain control over T'Pol, keeps trying to insist to Archer that he needs to go see her in sickbay and that he needs to have access to her mind. Archer is fortunately able to see through his bullshit, but the control was the point. He doesn't actually care about T'Pol, but he saw a vulnerable person and took advantage of the situation. The thing is about these Vulcans that live on this ship, they don't have a playbook. The other people on that ship have no reason to suspect they live with a rapist because they've never seen one. They don't know what problematic behavior looks like. Mind melds are a forbidden technique, and so Talaris' mama never sat him down and said it's not okay to do this to someone if they don't want it. That's definitely not absolving Talaris of blame, but I do think it absolves the rest of his crew from blame. However, there are a couple of problems with this episode. Some people did complain, and I do think it's a little justified that Talaris completely goes without punishment. He is told to leave the ship. He's not thrown in the brig. No one is warned about him. He's not punished in any way, which I didn't think was that big a deal. In the scope of the episode, I don't think it was as important that we saw something bad happen to Talaris as we saw the effect that it had on the people around T'Pol. And, of course, on T'Pol. T'Pol is approached by Archer later, and she asks him if he dreams, and she says something like she wishes she didn't dream at all. Because that's the Vulcan ideal, right? You don't want to want things. Wanting things can hurt you. But throughout the rest of these episodes, there's going to be a little tiny bit of a hint that they might be considering putting something, going on between Archer and T'Pol. And I don't think that that's fundamentally a flawed idea. I think you could do it. This series is about the relationship between Archer and T'Pol. I'm not excited about the idea of them being together because I think it would change the story fundamentally, but I do think it could be pulled off. However, there is something that gets in the way of that. There is a reason you cannot narratively do that with the structure that they have defined for the series. When we were talking about Dear Doctor, we talked about the fact that Archer is required by Paramount to always look like he's in the right. Archer always has to be the hero. He always has to know what's going on his ship, and he can't ever disagree with the correct interpretation of things. Archer's perspective is the perspective the audience is supposed to think is morally correct. But that's not workable in a story about human people. This season is about Archer learning to accept T'Pol and love her for who she is, really. And this episode is an incredibly important part of that. And in this episode, Archer unwittingly puts T'Pol in harm's way because he wants to change who she is. And then he has no accountability for it because he has to look like he's the hero. At the end, he's the one who pulls the gun on Talaris, so we can assume that he no longer thinks T'Pol needs to change, but it's not drawn attention to. He doesn't talk to her about the part that he played in this. He doesn't talk to her about what he thinks of her. He comes out, saves the day, he's the hero, after telling T'Pol she needed to spend time with this man because he wanted her to be different. You cannot have your cake and eat it too in regards to having a crew that doesn't know what they're doing and constantly fucks up, and a captain who's always right. It makes the captain look like a clueless asshole who doesn't take accountability. It wasn't Archer who assaulted T'Pol, but he did have a role to play, and the episode in the end disregards that. The show isn't allowed to acknowledge it due to the rules of the network, and it makes it feel like the episode makes a little bit no sense. But I think overall, the episode did enough. Every moment of this was carefully constructed. I was ridiculously impressed with the quality of the writing, the quality of the acting, the balance of tone throughout the episode, the way you never think they're going to actually go there, but you sure think that Talaris is bad news. I have to give the writers props for this one. They knocked it out of the park. And this episode is obviously not beloved because nobody ever wants to watch this episode again. But in the grand scheme of Star Trek Enterprise episodes that have dealt with difficult things, I think Fusion is clearly the best. The next episode is Rogue Planet. The Enterprise comes across this planet that has been knocked out of its orbit and, for some very unscientific reason, still has trees and normal wildlife on it. Anyway, another species of aliens comes here every year to hunt a particular type of prey that's native to the planet, a shape-shifting, mind-reading creature that is only detectable when they feel fear. The Enterprise meets up with these hunters, spends a few days hanging out with them, but eventually comes to the realization that what they're doing is hunting down a sentient species, really, and they end up deciding to augment the hunted society so that they can no longer give off this fear pheromone and they cannot be hunted anymore. I really liked this episode at the end. I did think it was very boring for the first most of it. Other than the fact that not very much happens in this episode, what initially turns people off of it is the fact that this shape-shifting creature appears to Archer as a beautiful woman in a nightgown. And everyone around Archer thinks that he's having sexy dreams and just isn't telling people about it. The audience thinks that Archer is having sexy dreams, but it turns out that Archer is actually thinking of a poem that he read that his mother used to read to him when he was a child, which was about an explorer who came across a beautiful woman in the woods and kept trying to find that woman for all time. This episode actually made me like Archer more. Unfortunately, there really isn't much to this episode. I think you could cut it down to 22 minutes if you really needed to and not miss anything, but the parts that are there, I actually really liked. We've talked a little bit in this video series so far that I think that Archer's characterization is pretty light. They have to keep him generic enough to be likable to the audience, but I think they're doing a really good job in this set of episodes of coming up with things that Archer can like and can do that don't alienate him from the audience, but give him his own motivation and personality that is consistent with a Star Trek captain. In this case, this episode is about his drive to become an explorer. What parts of his subconscious mind when he was a toddler made him become the man that he is today? He was fascinated by the unknown. He wanted to go see things. And that, I do think that's enough for a starship captain. I don't think you have to have this overly complicated character concept for Archer. I think you just have to pick something and do it well. And I think making Archer this explorer at heart at this point in the story is a really good decision. And he has this romantic ideal of what space travel and exploring the stars is supposed to be. And that really endeared me to Archer. Is this my favorite episode? No. Did I not like it though? No, I did like it. The next episode is Acquisition. So, fun fact about Acquisition, Brandon Braga actually apologized for the existence of this episode because it doesn't make sense with the timeline, which is a damn shame because this episode is hilarious and great. So what happens is Ferengi knock out everybody on the ship and try to steal all of their stuff, and Trip is left in the decon chamber so he isn't exposed to the knockout gas, so he has to work with Archer, whom they wake up, to take down the ship. Eventually also, or actually pretty early in the episode, Trip also wakes up T'Pol. So it's a Trip, T'Pol, and Archer working together episode. There's no character development. It's just the three main characters running around the ship, playing basically pranks on these Ferengi to turn them against each other and get them to leave. No one is harmed. Originally, when I was taking notes on this episode, I wrote the phrase "silly fun time" 6 times. What's interesting is that each of the three main characters takes like 6 levels in deception between the last episode and this one, and I'm actually okay with that. I really like the level of manipulation that we see from Trip, T'Pol, and Archer throughout this episode, because the conceit of Enterprise is that their ship is worse, they can't go as fast, they don't know what they're doing, and they have to lie, cheat, steal, beg for the things that they can get in this cruel galaxy. And I think that making our main characters more deceptive in a relatively harmless way is a great way to make that premise work. I really like this episode. No one grows, no one learns anything, but if I had to pick an episode to sit down and watch, it may actually be this one. I was thinking about it while I was watching this episode, and I think if you wanted to show somebody an episode of Enterprise to get them interested in the series, I actually think Acquisition would be a damn good choice. The next episode is Oasis. Oasis is maybe the boringest episode of this set. See, there's a little bit of a conflict here because Rogue Planet is boring for the first half, and Oasis is boring for the second half. But I think the boring parts of Oasis are more boring than the boring parts of Rogue Planet, and it's also boring for longer. So it's not that good. In this episode, the Enterprise is directed to a ship full of ghosts, and they go there and find a ship full of what later turns out to be holograms. An engineer and his 5-year-old daughter were the only survivors of a ship crashing into this planet. The engineer wasn't able to repair the ship, but he was able to create holographic versions of his fellow crew members and his wife to help him raise his child. He has a hydroponic garden, they have some kind of protein resequencing going on, and for the past 20 years, he and his daughter have lived there. His daughter is a beautiful young alien engineer, which means this is a Trip episode. Of all three of us who are working on the spreadsheet component of this project and taking notes and discussing each episode, and we're watching it together and all that stuff, all three of us had the exact same one note about this episode, which is that it's funny to watch T'Pol yell at Trip for dating alien engineers. And the rest of this episode is a snooze fest. At the beginning of the episode, we have two pairs of characters, Archer and Travis, and Trip and T'Pol exploring the ship. It's cool, we get to see characters interact. Travis obviously has a thing for ghost stories, so he and Archer immediately start to, imagine that they're seeing ghosts, as soon as they split off from the rest of the group. Trip and T'Pol, however, are people of science, and so it takes them a whole 35 seconds or so longer to start believing they're seeing ghosts. They come across the holographic crew, they meet everyone. Trip catches the eye of the engineer's daughter, takes her onto the Enterprise, and she's very, very excited to see it, weirdly so. It eventually turns out that she has never actually been off of that planet in the past 20 years, and that, like I said, everyone is dead. The crew talks to the father and convinces him to let them help him fix the ship and get them up and running so that they can return to their home planet and his daughter can have a normal life. That's the episode. It's a very TNG episode, and I think whenever Enterprise tries to be TNG, it falls on its face a little bit. I didn't think there was anything particularly bad about this episode, but there's just not much to it. The only other thing that I could think of that was notable is we see more of Trip being that very, very empathetic person. When Archer and Malcolm originally figure out that the ship has been there much longer than they said they were, Archer tasks Trip with talking to this young woman and getting the real answer about what happened to them out of her. And Trip approaches her with just the utmost respect and kindness. He handles the situation like a real leader and a real gentleman. And the reason I want to call this out is because we don't see this version of Trip for the rest of the season. Okay, we kind of do, but not to this extent. And for the rest of the season, he's going to get worse. In the following episode, Archer and Travis wake up in a Suliban detention center. There is a species called Tanarans who placed all of the Suliban on their homeworld into detention centers to keep them safe. And it has turned into an extremely obvious allegory for the Japanese internment camps that the United States had in World War II. So obvious, in fact, that they literally say that in the middle of the episode. However, this didn't really bother me. Like I said with Fusion, I think Enterprise is strongest when it tries to depict complex, horrible emotional situations, even if it's not trying to do so with a whole lot of nuance. And I think it really did it here. We see Archer meet a bunch of the Suliban in this prison camp. We see him meet a father who has a young daughter. His wife has been separated from him. They keep trying to appeal the wife's placement in a separate detention center and they can't get her moved there. At first, Archer and Travis are told that they will have a hearing in 3 days that will allow them to just go home. It turns out they're actually not Suliban, so everything's fine and they can just leave. They decide to try to follow the Prime Directive and go through their regular legal system, but as Archer starts being more and more sympathetic to the Suliban, the Tanaran prison warden guy starts being more and more hesitant to actually let Archer go. Eventually it becomes apparent that it's not going to happen, so Archer calls T'Pol, or T'Pol calls Archer really, and Archer says, "Fuck the Prime Directive. This situation is really bad. I want to hold a prison break." I think this episode does twists and turns super, super well. At first, you're not thinking that a prison break is on the table. It seems like just far too large a situation. But once you see the whole scope of what's going on, you see why Archer can't leave the situation alone. Where Fusion made the audience feel uncomfortable, this episode makes the audience feel hopeless in a way that is really communicative of how Archer is supposed to be feeling. I think this episode is very good. It's emotional, it's plot heavy, and it features a really good, more realistic moral quandary. This isn't the kind of moral quandary that you might see from other Star Trek, where they present a hypothetical that has not necessarily anything to do with real life, but can serve as a metaphor for a bunch of different things, and asks you to think about that as a way of thinking about other topics. This is a much more direct representation of something that happens in the world today. And the only moral question the episode poses is that it's possible that these people will get picked up by the Cabal, the evil organization of bad Suliban, and eventually turned into soldiers for the bad guys. Archer decides to take that risk in the name of justice, and it feels right even though you feel bad. I think it was very well executed. The only complaint that I have about this episode is the inclusion of Travis. Travis is really set decoration in this episode. It's like they had to give Archer a buddy, and they realized that it's been a while since we've had a Travis episode. Travis doesn't really do anything here, and he doesn't talk to Archer basically at all. I wouldn't call this out if it wasn't for the fact that Travis really doesn't have anything else going on. If Travis was more of a main character and he just had an episode where he wasn't doing very much, it wouldn't be as noticeable, like in Malcolm in Sleeping Dogs, where he was sick, so he just didn't really say anything. This was more of, why is Travis here kind of thing. It's obviously fine to have extra characters or unused detail, but I do think that Travis is a little bit pushed to the wayside. But next we get Vox Sola. I'm just going to say it. If this episode isn't the worst episode in all of Enterprise, I will be severely disappointed, because I fucking hated it. I tried to say that with a straight face, but I hate it so much I couldn't. I fucking despise this episode. There's nothing good about it. It's miserable from front to back. There isn't a scene in this episode that I found enjoyable. There wasn't a part where I could pause and look forward to watching it the following day. To be completely honest, so what happened was I wanted to watch an episode of Enterprise before bed. I watched Detained and it was kind of bleak. So I was like, fuck it, let's watch one more. And it was Vox Sola. I hated this episode so much, I had to watch the following episode, Fallen Hero, as a palate cleanser before I went to bed. I watched 3 episodes instead of 1 because Vox Sola sucked so bad. What happens in Vox Sola? A semen monster gets into the Enterprise and covers everybody in jizz. Also, everyone acts like the cartoon character version of themselves. The writing is bad. The visuals are bad. The acting is bad. Everything's terrible. I hate this episode. This one's basically like, it's so bad it's funny, pretty much. Like, so this is technically a Hoshi episode. My friends and I pretty much agreed that the best thing about this episode is the fact that neither of the main female characters get captured by the jizz monster. Okay, that's not entirely true. That is a good thing, but the other good thing about this episode is that they treat this jizz monster with compassion and take it back to its Bukkake planet at the end of the episode. But the general progression of this episode is that they piss off this other species for a reason they can't really understand, and Hoshi blames herself for it because she wasn't able to adequately translate what they were offended about. And it turns out later that the translation problem had nothing to do with Hoshi. T'Pol gives Hoshi shit for this for what appears to be no reason. T'Pol just randomly turns back into episode 2 T'Pol, bitchy, angry, annoying version of herself, and makes Hoshi feel really bad. Then Archer and Trip are captured by the Jizz Monster. The Jizz Monster takes over Cargo Bay 2. It captures several members of the crew, including Archer and Trip, and it starts assimilating them into its Pandora from Avatar collective of linked minds. It's magic jizz. After that, T'Pol, who's left in charge, tasks Malcolm with trying to find a way to kill it, but because everybody's connected to each other, harming it harms the people who are connected to it, so she allows Hoshi to try to communicate with it. Additionally, Malcolm develops shields in this episode. Unfortunately, there are 2 major developments in this episode that make it technically unskippable as to the development of the ship and the characters. The first thing that it does is it establishes the shields that Malcolm makes, their particle shields. I assume these are going to come back because this seems like the kind of thing that would come back, but also it establishes this like mentor-student relationship between T'Pol and Hoshi that had the potential to be really charming and interesting, but instead it was introduced in this episode. So it sucks. Basically, Hoshi talks to T'Pol and is like, "Why do you always treat me like shit?" And T'Pol gives the most cliche answer of all time, which is, "I treat you like garbage because I believe in you. And I'm mean to you because I'm trying to push you to get better. And it sucks. I hate this trope. It's so lazy. I literally was watching this and I thought that the person who was writing it was just added to the writing staff and they didn't watch the previous episodes or read the previous scripts or whatever the heck was going on. It feels like they mushed a bunch of cliches together and everybody is a flattened version of themselves. It's bad. The end result is that every scene that is an interaction of 2 characters feels horrible because the characters are not acting like themselves. And every scene that's about the plot, which is about the Jizz Monster, is horrible because the plot is about a Jizz Monster. The only saving grace of this episode is the fact that Trip goes to Archer and offers to watch water polo with him after the bad situation at the beginning leaves Archer in a terrible mood. This made me think that Trip is one of the most valuable people on the ship. However, later on in the episode, Trip is shown to be so mind-numbingly loyal to Archer that after Archer is captured by the Jizz Monster, Trip jumps in after him and is captured literally about a half-second later. This is going to continue when we get to the final episode. Put a pin in this. I had to pause this episode and take this paragraph-long note. It says, "This episode makes everybody involved feel lame. Hoshi sucks at her job, T'Pol makes bad judgments in Archer's place, Archer is mopey and gets captured immediately, Trip gets himself captured when Archer does, Malcolm is slow to respond in the only crisis his job is about, Phlox does the bare minimum, and Travis isn't in this episode, but it seems like a mercy." After this, Travis does the only useful thing anyone does in this episode. Eventually, Hoshi figures out how to communicate with the Jizz Monster using math, with the help of T'Pol, who knows math, and they take the Jizz Monster back to his home planet. I was really mad, but now that I'm talking about it, it's funny how terrible it is. I really hope we don't get anything this bad, though. I would have been more okay with this episode if the characterization wasn't so wrong. If everybody wasn't so lame, in addition to the fact that it's about a jizz monster. It looks like a big, clumpy pile of semen. The next episode is Fallen Hero. This one is good. It's actually also rated the second highest in the season, and I kind of don't think it deserves that, but I do think it was good. This episode is an actual T'Pol episode in which she isn't sexualized in any way. We sort of examine what T'Pol's motivations are and what her internal life is like from a more positive angle. What happens is T'Pol's childhood hero, a Vulcan ambassador who negotiated all kinds of interesting treaties with other species, is disgraced and dismissed from her post. The Enterprise is ordered to pick her up and take her to a Vulcan ship that is farther away for her protection. T'Pol is severely disappointed in this news that her hero is not the hero that she thought she was. But eventually she's able to talk to this woman, Malar. And around this time, the ship is pursued by people who are trying to come after Malar, is the name of the ambassador, which puts the ship at risk. Archer seriously considers leaving Malar to die in order to preserve the life of the crew. But Malar reaches out to T'Pol and tries to mend the bridge that's kind of been broken there, in the hopes that T'Pol will communicate with Archer and convince him to risk the lives of everyone in the crew for her sake. It's an interesting episode for sure. I will say I didn't have much to think about after it was over, but it was a very enjoyable time when I watched it. The relationship between T'Pol and Malar is very sweet. It's nice to see T'Pol having, for one, a positive interaction with an older woman, a positive interaction with another Vulcan. Malar is the version of T'Pol that we hope to see 100 years from now. Malar has lived with with emotional species who aren't Vulcans for a very long time, and because of that, she's like the good version of the emotional Vulcans that we saw. She hasn't pushed her own boundaries too far, but she is willing to, drink lots of tea and shake hands, and she's comfortable with the boundaries that she's set for herself, really. She's comfortable with how far she's pushed herself. She has her own habits that she's happy with. She's interested in other people, and she cares. Something I've been alluding to, but I've been kind of avoiding because I wanted to have enough evidence, is what I call the T'Pol color theory. Whenever T'Pol is seen around pink or purple, we're dealing with her emotions. But whenever she's wearing pink or purple, she is being too emotional. She's pushing herself too far. In the scene where the mind meld occurs, she's wearing purple. But in the scene where she's talking to Trip about potentially breaking off her engagement, and he's kind of introducing her to the idea of maybe making her own decisions, we just see the pink and purple decorations in her room in the background. This is like more of an appropriate level of emotion for her to be showing. It's not pushing herself too far. What's interesting about Malar is that she wears a pinkish purple shirt and a cloak of the same color gray that T'Pol wears. It's like a purplish blue gray that's heathered in the same pattern. She also has like embroidery on it, but when you look at the whole cloak, it's that same pattern that T'Pol wears. I think this is very clear symbolism that this is what T'Pol is supposed to be in the future. She has her emotions on the inside, but she wears her logic on the outside. She has a balance of both. She has decided on her own limits, and she operates on her own terms. She's friendly with other people, she cares, she's aware of her own emotions, and isn't easily manipulated. But she is also logical, like a real Vulcan. There's a reason this woman was T'Pol's childhood hero, and there's a reason she's a good mentor for T'Pol now. But one of my favorite things that this episode does is the conversation that T'Pol has with Malar, where she asks Malar to talk to Archer about why she's really here, to sort of open up to Archer and ask him for her help. Ask him for his help. And in this conversation, T'Pol tells Malar that the reason Archer resents her and resents Vulcans is because the Vulcans really truly have held humans back. This is a level of awareness that T'Pol does not show in front of Archer. She doesn't acknowledge Archer's complaints when he has them. She just pushes past it. I felt like T'Pol was more of a victim of Archer's treatment before this moment. But now it's clear that T'Pol actually knows exactly what the Vulcans have been doing and may have even participated. In fact, her job is to participate. This makes T'Pol feel like much more on equal playing field with Archer specifically. I thought it was an excellent touch. But ultimately what it comes down to is that Millar asks T'Pol to ask Archer to risk everyone on the ship for Millar's sake. And T'Pol goes to Archer and she says, "I have never asked you for anything, but I'm asking you now to save this woman." And it's emotionally impactful because we are at episode number 23 out of 26. This is Archer's arc. This is the arc of the season. This season is about T'Pol and Archer learning to trust each other, really. At this point, T'Pol places her trust in Archer as a way to ask him to trust her. It's very important to their character development specifically. It's also interesting how even having one second Vulcan on the ship changes the dynamic to the Vulcans being in power. The moment T'Pol finds out that Millar is coming, she starts writing up documentation for, how to treat an old Vulcan woman and all this kind of stuff. But also, everybody conforms to this. Millar is the ambassador on the ship, and T'Pol is the person who facilitates her communication with everybody else. Archer is still the captain, but it feels like any of those TNG episodes where somebody more important comes onto the ship. And it makes it so that the Vulcans are in a place of power for this episode, which is very interesting. I do want to say that the scene where they're playing chicken with the other ships that can go Warp 5 really rocks. I still remember that scene in almost perfect clarity decades later after watching it for the first time. I think that's an absolutely fantastic and exciting sequence, especially for an episode that is about an elderly ambassador sitting around drinking tea and talking. It's very exciting. It rocks. I do think that the aliens that are pursuing Millar, who have this interesting wave form on their cheekbone here, I thought that was a cool design. Of the slapped together alien designs we've seen, this is certainly one of my favorites. Desert Crossing is also a really interesting episode. The Enterprise is lured into helping this ship with mechanical problems, and it turns out that their captain is actually trying to get Trip and Archer down onto the planet to ask Archer for help fighting a war for them. He has heard that Archer was basically a war hero who broke all these Suliban out of prison, and he says, "My people are being oppressed. Can you help us get out of this?" He thinks that if he recruits Archer, they will be able to win this civil war that's happening on their planet. Eventually, the place that they're in is airstruck. Archer and Trip have to cross the desert to get away from it and back to their shuttle pod. However, when they are crossing, Trip is unable to handle the heat. Like a true Floridian, he hates the desert. And after several kilometers of trudging through the desert in the heat of day, he develops heat stroke. It is acknowledged that it's a bad idea to try to cross the desert during the day, but they are literally trying to get away from an airstrike. I'm not sure what their other option was. Trip develops heat stroke, and Archer starts to seriously contemplate the idea that he has lured his best friend to die, pretty much, on accident, for no reason. It's a poignant episode, even if it's kind of lacking a little bit. Like, there's no B-plot, and the A-plot, while strong, isn't the strongest we've seen, but I did overall like this episode. Eventually, T'Pol is able to talk the captain of the other ship into helping them get down to the planet to rescue Archer and Trip, but Archer talks to the other captain and says, "Look, I'm not this war hero, and I can't help you fight this war for you." He has this conversation with T'Pol at the end, where T'Pol basically says, "You're a starship captain. The reason why protocols exist is so that you don't have to decide whether you're going to win the war for every planet you come across." It's an interesting examination of the Star Trek formula, and particularly of this series where the protocols don't really exist yet. I like this episode. Next we have 2 Days and 2 Nights. There were parts of this episode that were good. I guess. What happens is the crew goes on shore leave. Phlox starts hibernating. Travis goes rock climbing. Archer stays in a hotel to try to do as much nothing as possible. Malcolm and Trip try to get laid, and Hoshi actually does get laid. And T'Pol stays on the ship and enjoys being the last bridge officer on the ship. I want to start by talking about Malcolm and Trip. So what happens in this episode is Malcolm and Trip go to bars on this vacation planet and try to pick up girls by pretending to be starship captains. Now, the very first thing we learn about Trip is that he is a gentleman. He's a country bumpkin who values Southern values, honesty, and I don't believe for a minute that he can't go to a random alien planet and get laid, since he's the Riker of this show, right? Like, every time they meet a single young female alien engineer, he almost, or actually does, get pregnant. The charm that was written into Trip from the conception of his character is enough for him to not have to go to bars and lie about who he is. So I thought, when I was first watching this, that the joke was that Malcolm makes Trip worse. Although admittedly, I was really reaching here. I was looking for a reason why this was consistent. But after the next episode, I really felt like the writers just forgot who Trip is or something. Like, this is the start of what is called flanderization, which is where you take a three-dimensional character and that's too complicated and too difficult to manage, so you start to condense this character down into smaller and smaller subsets of the character traits they used to have to make them more manageable. I guess the friendship between Malcolm and Trip pulled well, so it would be really funny if they go down to a planet and try to get laid and then end up getting mugged. I didn't like this plotline. I think this could have been handled better if they had thought about it for 5 more minutes. There was a way they could have done this and made it entertaining, but instead they just made the two secondary male characters, I guess you could say, look stupid. Travis falls off the side of a rock face, and they have to wake Phlox up to treat him because when he went to the alien hospital, he had an allergic reaction to what they gave him. I appreciated the fact that T'Pol chewed him out for being unwilling to go to an alien hospital when she lived on an alien ship and lived on Earth for who knows how long before this. Hoshi meets a mysterious and kind young man from a planet where the language is extremely difficult to learn. She tries to get him to teach her the language, and instead proceeds to communication that requires no words. I wish I was better at coming up with euphemisms on the spot. I liked this plotline a little bit. There isn't much to it. It was just nice to see Hoshi happy. Nobody is chewing her out. She's hanging out with a boy she likes. It was nice to see Hoshi having a nice time. She deserved it. I do like the design of the love interest they came up with for her. I also like the design of the love interest they came up with for Archer, actually. Even though they serve completely different purposes, I thought that what they came up with was good. Then there's Archer's plotline. Archer's is a little bit more plot relevant. When he's at his hotel, he meets this woman who also has a dog. She's a widow around his age who comes from a planet that he doesn't know what it is. It turns out later she's Tandaran, and she's actually been planted to try to find out what he knows about Suliban. At first, she doesn't get very much information from him, but as their time together draws to a close, she becomes more and more obvious about it until Archer straight up figures it out and kicks her out. I guess I appreciate that at this point Archer is starting to understand that racism is bad. There wasn't a whole lot to this plot line. We know that Tandarans are pursuing Archer now because they hate Suliban and they think he knows more than he does, but that's about it. It's an adequate episode. It's fine. Finally, we have Shockwave. I hated this episode too. I feel like I spent a lot of this time complaining, but I swear I still like the series. This episode is bad. I didn't like it. It's not good. And it could have been so good if they changed like 4 things. but they didn't change those 4 things, so instead the episode's bad. So what happens in this episode is the Enterprise accidentally obliterates a colony of 3,600 people, and the Starfleet Command is recommended by the Vulcans to shut down the Enterprise program, or shut down the Warp 5 ship program. They are recalled and intending to go home, but it turns out that actually this is like a temporal Cold War thing. Daniels comes in from the future to tell him to look at their shuttlecraft, see if they can find some like Suliban technology that framed them for the murder of these 3,600 people. What I hate about this episode is, well, there's several things I hate about this episode, actually. Actually, more than 4 things, but let's talk about the big ones. For one, nobody, except Archer a little bit, displays even the slightest amount of remorse for the death of these people. The Enterprise came in here and wiped out an entire colony. They talk about the scorch marks, and nobody cares. The most important thing to them is that they're going to have to go home. It's heartless and unbelievable and awful. Like, it's a level of thoughtlessness I can't believe this series has. I think the level of remorse that the characters show is appropriate if they accidentally killed an ambassador or destroyed sacred ground. But they wiped out a colony and no one gives a shit. It's bizarre. Hoshi and Travis have this conversation about how they don't know how they're going to get new jobs, but if anybody says anything negative about Captain Archer, they're going to give him what for. But the worst one is Trip. The problem with Trip at this point is that the writers are under the impression that his loyalty to Archer has pushed him to the point of insanity. Like, Trip has no sense of well-being anymore. He only cares about whether Archer is happy, even at the expense of everything else. I feel like they're probably setting up for some future conflict between Archer and Trip, but that's not what's happening. Instead, they've just turned Trip into this mindless... One of my friends said the word lapdog, and I can't not think it. When this whole thing goes down, Trip is infuriated that Starfleet is canceling this mission because Archer has always wanted to be the captain of the Enterprise, basically. He says, I can't believe they would do this to Archer. He doesn't think about the 3,600 people they killed. He doesn't think about the mission or humanity or whatever. And then he goes and whines at Phlox for a while. It's weird characterization. I don't know what the hell they were thinking. It's like they knew they had to do something with Trip, and they just, like, came up with something random. It's not good. It makes him unlikable. See, the thing is, when I first started talking about this series, I was talking about how this show has arcs when other shows didn't do that as much. But I kind of feel like eating my words. The overarching story of the beginning of Star Trek Enterprise is about the temporal Cold War arc. And although I appreciate the character arcs and the arcs to do with the ship and the arcs about, the Vulcans and all that stuff, the actual plot, the temporal Cold War arc, is just not good. You can tell they haven't thought about anything. They don't keep track of details from episode to episode. It contradicts itself. It's not planned. And if you're going to plan any kind of plot, you have to plan a time travel plot. This whole timeline is being constructed based on 2 warring parties from the future, and the writers have no fucking clue what happens in the future. That's not acceptable. If you can't handle this plot line, you should have picked something else. So why did they pick this plot line? For one, I think they might have been trying to capture the Quantum Leap fans, since Quantum Leap also starred Scott Bakula and was about time travel. But I think the other thing it does is try to justify the existence of this series. Some people think that prequels are always bad, which is just a dumb rule. Pointless. It's not like this is the story of Picard when he was a teenager. This is This takes place 100 years before the original series. I mean, it's not necessary, but no television is necessary. But it feels like this particular plot, the temporal Cold War arc, is trying to justify the existence of the series because they keep saying that this ship is so important, Archer is so important, and please keep watching because if you care about Star Trek, you have to care about Jonathan Archer. I should care about Jonathan Archer because he's a good character. I shouldn't feel like I have to watch this because Jonathan Archer is important to the history of Star Trek. We all know that 2 of the other series take place on an Enterprise. We're aware that the first Enterprise is important. We can see the development of certain policies and technologies that will be really important later happening here. The only thing that happens in this plotline is people telling Jonathan Archer how important he is over and over. They can't even keep track of why. In the previous episode that was about the temporal Cold War, which was Cold Front, Silik was trying to prevent the ship from being destroyed. But in this episode, Daniels is trying to prevent the ship from being destroyed. What? And it comes across entirely like they literally didn't write down what they did a couple weeks ago. Like, people's motivations make no sense. I guarantee you they hadn't decided what everybody's motivations were at this point. And we're going to get right back to this when we talk about the overall rankings of these episodes. But real quick, I just want to call out something. There is one thing that this episode does well, and that is that it wraps up this season's arc about the relationship between Archer and T'Pol. That part is executed well. I actually commented while I was watching this episode, I said, it's like there's a good characterization stick, and between Trip, T'Pol, and Archer, only 2 of them can be holding that stick at the same time. And then later I said, and one of them always has to be T'Pol. I liked Archer in this episode so much. He finally admits to himself and to T'Pol that he says, I need you to believe me that I went back in time. Because T'Pol keeps insisting that time travel is impossible. He says, you are my first officer, and I need you to believe that I have time traveled. And it's an emotional plea. It's a distillation of everything that has happened up to this point between them. But for the first time, I feel like his request is reasonable. He's not asking her to eat chicken. He's not asking her to spend time with people who make her uncomfortable. He's asking her to have an emotional reaction just once for him. It's a reasonable ask. He says, I want you to trust that I know what I'm seeing with my eyes. It actually kind of ties back into Rogue Planet, where T'Pol asked him, hey, are you sure you're not dreaming about this woman because you're lonely and you're dreaming about a woman, you know? But he asks her here to believe him, and I thought it was very poignant, because I have wondered if I was imagining the leadership problems that we've been seeing, you know. Throughout this video series, I have been saying over and over, everything would be so much better on this ship if Archer just told everyone, T'Pol is the first officer and you have to fucking listen to her. But he keeps not doing it until the last 5 minutes of this episode. Archer decides to give himself up for the sake of the ship because they have no idea what the hell's going on and they have no defenses against this big horde of Suliban ships that's coming after them. And he has this moment where he says, T'Pol is in charge now, Trip. You need to help her. That goes for all of you. And he looks at everyone in turn and he gives T'Pol control of the ship. And it seems like it's not that important unless you look at the whole season in which he has repeatedly, deliberately avoided saying exactly this. He's never willing to acknowledge to everyone that T'Pol is his right hand until this moment. And this is the completion of his arc this season. But it's also the start of a new arc. And I like what they're doing with Archer now. Archer gives himself up to the Suliban because he realizes that they are way out of their depth. Every episode they have to lie, beg, manipulate, ask for help in order to get anywhere. And he realizes just how small fish they are. At this point, they don't have a choice, but he goes to the Suliban in the hopes that he can be in the room with somebody who knows something. He wants to get his ship an edge, even if it's just a half step higher. And that's what makes me like Jonathan Archer now. I've hated him this whole time, but I feel like this really established what kind of captain he is. He's willing to do whatever it takes to pull the Enterprise just half a rung higher, especially if it's at his own expense. And I thought this was fantastic character development. And I'm sorry, everything else about this episode kind of sucked to get there. So that's the last 10 episodes of Season 1 of Enterprise. But before I log off, I'd like to show you something. And I think it's really, really interesting. I'm pulling out my spreadsheet. Take a peek at this spreadsheet. So there's not a whole lot of information in here, but we've got a list of the episodes in order. We've got the characters that are in the episode, a primary and potentially a secondary character. We've got the type of episode, so I divided them up into plot, ship, and planet. So planet is they go to a planet, ship, they stay on the ship. Plot is something related to the plot. Then I gave it a tone. These weren't super consistent. You know, maybe was it silly, or it had a first contact, or maybe it was positive, warm feeling, or was it dark, or a mystery, or whatever. I just gave it a little quick description just so I remembered it. But then I had my friends rank them. And full disclosure, of course, my friends are very much like me. They value the same things in stories that I do. While we differed a little bit, ultimately what you're looking at is the score that's determined by people who really, really like Star Trek and really have been paying attention, taking notes on each episode, and caring about the progression of the characters pretty much, you know, first and foremost. We're not week-to-week viewers. We're watching these with intention, and we're watching them while taking notes and that kind of thing. Then I took the IMDb score of each episode, and I wanted to compare how they differed. I also did a little game where I had them guess which IMDb score went to each thing. But I wanted to show you some patterns that occurred here. So for one, okay, sorry, I forgot to set the header row on this, so this is going to be a little embarrassing. Here is the list of episodes as we ranked them, and here's why we ranked each of them the way we did. So our first ranked episode is actually Breaking the Ice. Breaking the Ice was episode 8. It's the one where T'Pol breaks up with her fiance. They get letters from 4th graders, and they pass by an ice comet that's really cool. We liked this episode because there's an A, B, and C plot that are all fantastic. Each scene is enjoyable, even if it's not super plot relevant. You can enjoy what's going on at any given time. It progresses multiple characters in a meaningful way, particularly T'Pol. And it also has a lot of fun detail, like the snowman that they make on the comet and the pie. The next episode we picked was Shuttlepod 1. We thought the acting was great, the writing was great, and the same goes here for Fusion. We thought both of these, it was interesting that there's very low budget relative to some of the other episodes in this season, but they decide to prioritize the relationship between characters and the interactions of certain ideas, and it does something really great that we liked a lot. Next we went with Unexpected. It's a fun episode. Everybody really likes it. It's a fun time, and it definitely gets points for being a turning point in the series, where the series is really starting to get its footing. Next was Acquisition, for similar reasons. It's a fun time. Everybody enjoyed watching it. Silent Enemy. It's got an A and B plot that are both good. Sleeping Dogs, we really enjoyed as well. Shadows of Pajem was rated a little bit lower than it could have been because we were all a little bit peeved by the fetish material, but it still seems like it's the right place to put this. The Andorian incident, we generally liked, but it doesn't have the charm that other episodes do, although it's good. Fallen Hero, we thought was strong, maybe not as strong as, some of the ones above it. Desert Crossing, we've talked about today. Detained, good, not amazing. Fortunate Son, another Travis episode. It has great ideas, but it's bogged down by a pretty mediocre exploration of the ideas that it presents. Then we put Shockwave. We were all distracted by the lack of accountability that anybody seemed to show, or remorse of the death of these 3,600 people. Even when it turns out they were not the ones who killed them, they don't mourn them, and it's weird. Then we put Broken Bow. It's a good pilot. It's not our favorite episode. Everybody still behaves kind of annoyingly because they're at their most flawed in the pilot. We put Cold Front here. It's distracting how poorly thought out the temporal Cold War arc is, and there are certainly things to like about it, but it's not our favorite. Then we put 2 Days and 2 Nights, Rogue Planet, Strange New World, Civilization, Terra Nova, Oasis, Fight or Flight, Vox Sola, and then I was outvoted. My 2 friends thought that Dear Doctor was worse. So let's examine which things ended up being our favorites. What's interesting is that all of the plot episodes fall firmly in the middle for us. There weren't any terrible plot episodes, but there weren't any amazing ones. We're going to get back to this in a second when we look at the IMDb scores. Almost all of our favorite episodes were up here in the top, where the episodes are labeled ship. One of my friends theorizes that this is because when the characters are confined to the ship, the main bridge crew is interacting with each other rather than interacting with some random alien female engineer or lady they met on the planet, like in Civilization or Rogue Planet. You can see the planet episodes are at the bottom for the most part. We've got a couple of ship episodes in here, but not too many. It's also notable that Trip, T'Pol, and Malcolm seem to be the best executed characters in the show. If we go top down, we have to reach Detained, which was our rank number 12, before you get to one that's not about Trip, T'Pol, and or Malcolm. However, from the bottom, we have, like, I wouldn't even call Vox Sola a T'Pol episode. You have to go all the way up to Strange New World until you meet any of them, or Oasis, rather. There's far less representation of Trip, T'Pol, or Malcolm in the bottom set of episodes. That's because Archer, obviously he was still getting his footing. Hoshi episodes, while Hoshi herself is very charming, Hoshi's charm seems to consistently be used to mask weak episode concepts. Maybe not consistently. We have to have a couple more data points to be able to call that. So that's what we noticed about our own preferences, but let's see what happens when we sort by the user's IMDb scores. So here's the IMDb scores from users who went on IMDb, particularly. Now, of course, this includes people who watched it later, but it does include people who watched it at the time the episodes were coming out. The highest rated episode was Shockwave Part 1, and I believe that is because it's important to the plot. If we look at the top rated episodes, we've got the Shockwave Part 1, the Andorian Incident, Fallen Hero, Dear Doctor. All of these share a feeling of self-respect. Dear Doctor called Dear Doctor up its own ass. Dear Doctor presents itself as being a very important episode. If we look at the silly episodes, they're closer to the middle. We've got Acquisition and Unexpected down here. People don't really think that silly episodes are important or good relative to ones that are dark or plot heavy. If you notice, the lowest rated plot episode is actually Detained, down at rank 12. So viewers see plot relevant episodes as being better, regardless of whether they are better. Fallen Hero was one that, like I said, I liked this episode for sure, but should it be tied for second place? I actually don't think so. It's a great episode, but I believe the reason why people rated it so high is because it feels dignified. There's an ambassador on the ship. Everyone's on their best behavior. They talk about deep philosophical things, but the political plot that Millar describes is pretty bog standard. And while there's good character development, I don't think this one's any more special than some of the others, like Shuttlepod 1, Silent Enemy, or frankly Unexpected. It's a good episode, but is it amazing? No. Is Shockwave amazing? Definitely not. Dear Doctor, it ended up being last on our list. And of course, these are all based on opinion. But if you slow down and think about what you actually like, I think most people would also disagree with this list. Just because something is quote-unquote important doesn't mean it's better. But I'm glad we did this because previously I was looking at the IMDb scores for each episode and I was utterly baffled as to some of these scores. Fortunate Son is the lowest rated episode of this season, and I kinda don't know why. Really what we're seeing here is, the planet episodes are still closer to the bottom, but the ship episodes and the plot episodes are swapped from the popular score and our score, which I guess we can almost call the critic score at this point. And I do honestly believe that these episodes in the middle are better than the episodes at the top. I don't think there's anything particularly special about Cold Front. It's a good, solid episode, but the fact that it involves the temporal Cold War doesn't make it better. It just makes it more important if you want to skip some of them with a new viewer. Anyway, that's my very first spreadsheet for this channel. I hope you were entertained. I'm going to keep doing these, keep updating this, and keep asking my friends what they think, because I do want to understand the audience reaction to this. Like I have said a couple of times, the audience reaction to this show was so negative that it was canceled very early, and for reasons that were not necessarily congruous with the actual problems the show had. It was canceled for reasons like people were tired of Star Trek, which is not really Enterprise's fault. It was also canceled for reasons like people didn't want so much horny material, which is the show's fault, but is also something that could have easily been repaired. If people were unhappy with the level of sexualization, they could have literally stopped doing it at any time. But as we go forward, I want to examine what people thought of each episode and why. Because ultimately, unfortunately, what's notable about Enterprise is that it didn't get to finish what it tried to do. With only 5 episodes warning before the show was canceled, many of the plot points are wrapped up very, very quickly, and most of them are never resolved at all. Many character arcs do not reach the conclusion they would have otherwise reached. And that is, in my opinion, a bad thing. We want to know why that happened so it can not happen again. We also want to know what they could have done better and differently. So that's season 1 of Enterprise. Next week I'll be starting season 2. We're going to be talking about episodes 1 through 9 in season 2. So that's Shockwave Part 2 through Singularity. See you at the next one.